So now we're going to cover the insects, that part of the mandibulates, that part of the arthropods. Definitely more insects on the books than any other group. And that is partly because there's a whole bunch of different types of insects, and also partly because people collect insects. And sorry about the weird hair. And there's a whole premium to being able to name new species. Remember, differentiating beetle species based on how their genitals are built is you know, you get quite a ways down the list of how to tell them apart before you get to something like that. This one just says, "Mom, he's doing it again." Insects. Certain things that are pretty set. Head, thorax, where the legs and the wings attach, abdomen. 3 body sections. In crustaceans, there's a variety of body sections. Typically 2, but sometimes others, and sometimes like in millipedes and centipedes, there are no body sections. Spiders tend to have 2 body sections, but that's not always true for all arachnids. But the 3 body sections is pretty well set in the insects. 3 pairs of legs, 6 legs, pretty well set in the insects. 2 sets of wings, pretty well set in the insects, although there are still some very primitive insects around that don't have wings. And there are certain groups of insects that have basically discarded their wings. They have just little nubs. And some of them have a set of wings under a wing cover that's a modified wing. The flies have 2 working wings and then 2 little Tootsie Pop knobs that counterbalance when the wings go up, the knobs go down. So there's a lot of variety in that. And then the abdomen. So, 3 body sections. 6 legs. There are a handful of the thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of species of winged insects. There's just a very short list of those insects that get their wings before their very last molt, where they become adults. So if you see an insect with wings, it's not going to get any bigger. It's hit its adult stage. And sometimes they're really small, and sometimes there's a variety of different sized adults in a population. But those wings come out in the last molt, and typically insects go through 6 to 7 stages, and that's it. Is that they go through a limited number of molts between when they hatch from the egg and when they hit their adult form. That's going to be the last form that they have. Remember that open circulation system is not great for circulating oxygen. Some arthropods have oxygen carriers in the blood the same way that we do, but even still, not the best system for circulating oxygen. Insects have a secondary system of tubes that connect to the outside air, and those tubes run, and it branches and branches and branches and branches, and pretty much every cell in the body is near the end branch of this tracheal system. And so air oxygen, remember there's a lot of oxygen in the air. Air oxygen is nearby when they need it. It's not always full of air because it's a lot of surface to lose water through. But when an insect is flying, for instance, the tracheal system is supplying their flight muscles with lots of oxygen, getting the carbon dioxide out of there pretty quickly too. Two different life cycles in insects. Something like a grasshopper, a young grasshopper, they call it a nymph, looks like a grasshopper without wings and smaller. Small crickets the same way. If you feed crickets to somebody, and you get crickets from the store, you can tell the difference between an adult cricket and a non-adult cricket by whether they have full wings. The nymphs have little bitty, nubs of wings. And typically when you buy crickets in the store, they're selling them before they get to their adult form. They're cranking them out and getting them out into the stores, because their last form before they become adults is pretty close to adult size. Definitely big enough to sell to people to feed them to things that eat insects. Indirect development, the young form doesn't look like the adults, and very often is in a different niche. It exists in the environment doing a different thing than the adults do. This means that they can double up the environment in terms of what's called carrying capacity. How many individuals in this population can the environment support? Well, if you're a mosquito larvae living in the water, as opposed to an adult mosquito feeding off of plant juices, which is typically what adult mosquitoes do. They only get blood, the females get blood because they need some proteins in that to make eggs. The larvae in the water and the adults are in a totally different niche. So there's carrying capacity for the larvae and a carrying capacity for the adults, which adds up to the carrying capacity for mosquitoes in the environment. So it's not always true that they are not doing the same thing, but it's largely true. Caterpillars generally not feeding on the same thing as butterflies or moths. Sometimes the butterflies or moths don't feed at all. They're purely a reproductive and what's called a dispersal form. The adults fly, they can spread out from where the larvae are. But the indirect development goes through a change called metamorphosis. This also will come up when we talk about amphibians. And what comes out of the egg is a larval form, like maggots for flies. They generally go into a pupal form, kind of an intermediate form. In butterflies, think the cocoon. And what comes out of that is the adult form with wings, if it's a winged insect. Fleas do this too, and their adults don't have wings. You can take the insects and divide them into 4 subgroups. Now this is a subphylum, so what would be in here would ordinarily be classes, except these subgroups often contain multiple classes. You'll see why in a second when I tell you how they're divided up. As I mentioned before, there are some primitive insects that don't have any wings. Collembolans, something called fire brats, and they've never had wings. It's that they were early members of the insect group, and they evolved before wings evolved, and they're still around. They're small, you probably have never seen one, but they're out there. They're not rare, they're just small and they hide real well. The collembolans have this neat little thing called a furcula. It's this rod up against their bellies that's kind of clicked in place, and there's a highly elastic ligament attached to it. And if you bug them, they release it, it goes doink, and you've got them and then they disappear. The furcula flips them out of the way. Is that fleas do something similar with their back legs, where their back legs are kind of spring-loaded, and when they need to jump, boom, they just kind of disappear on you. What they've done is they've jumped away. But fleas are not in this group. Fleas are non-winged, but they're not primitive. There are 2 different ways to build a wing system. And it has to do with how the muscles attach to the wings or don't attach to the wings, how the wings are driven. In the primitive approach, the muscles attach directly to the wings and pull them up and down, and there's a pivot point that moves the wings up and down. There's a limit to how fast you can get that to go. And this would include things like dragonflies and damselflies and a whole bunch of other classes of insects, some of which have the wings kind of locked out all the time, some of which can fold the wings back. They're pretty good flyers, but there's a limit to how fast they can move the wings under those conditions. Most flying insects that have functional wings are in the winged modern group. This one we're going to break down a little bit. But they actually drive the wings indirectly by moving parts of the thorax around them that kind of pivots up and down on against the wings that makes them go. And you can make them go really, really fast. They've got a special type of muscle that contracts multiple times from just one nerve impulse. And something like a mosquito, when that goes by you, is that those wings can be moving as fast as 1,100 times a second. It can make the wing system move very quickly. Not necessarily. This includes things where the wings just flutter like butterflies, but the drive system is still different. So I'm going to put some examples here. Obviously, the grasshoppers, your typical insect. Things included in this are things like crickets and katydids, but also things like cockroaches. Cockroaches are in the group with the grasshoppers as well. All direct developers. The little guys look like the big guys, just without wings. And there's a lot of different groups here. There's literally a group that's called the true bugs. One of my professors that I took insect stuff from used to be really annoyed if I called anything a bug that wasn't actually a bug, and these are they're kind of angular, leaf hoppers. There's big water bugs around here they call water boatmen. They get really big things. Cicadas are in this group. Number of different groups that are in what's called the true bugs, the hemipterans. The most named species are in the beetles. Lots of people collect beetles, and then there's this organization of collectors that just kind of adds and adds and adds to the species. Hard, shiny exoskeleton. Back doesn't look like it's got wings because their wing covers kind of molded to the back of the beetle, but there are wings underneath there that may or may not be functional, as we have beetles in the lab that don't fly. They got wings, but they don't fly. Happens sometimes. Butterflies and moths. The difference is somewhat technical, but typically a moth's wings are folded back over their back, and they look a little fuzzier. They have all these scales on them that make them look fuzzy. And butterflies, when they fold their wings, tends to fold up behind them. You can't depend on that all the time. The antennae are slightly different. Moths are typically night flyers, but not always. Butterflies are typically day flyers, but not always. So there's a lot of sort of clues where if you follow those clues, most of the time you're going to be right when you call it a butterfly and right when you call it a moth. But there are some technicalities. There are some very butterfly-looking moths and some very mothy-looking butterflies based on the real technical differences between them. I can't spell. That's supposed to say flies, F-L-I-E-S. Flies, pretty big group, only two wings. They have those two balancers that look like Tootsie Pops I talked about earlier. Indirect developers, beetles are indirect developers, butterflies and moths are indirect developers. Flies famous for their maggot stages. This includes mosquitoes. The termites, the ants, the bees, and the wasps used to be lumped together. They pretty much separated the termites out into their own class. And the ants and bees and wasps are all pretty much in the same group. They're the epitome of a weird type of intelligence, kind of a what they call a hive or collective intelligence. Although individually, bees and ants can be fairly smart in and of themselves, but as a colony, they actually work kind of collectively. Some people have compared it to like brain cells in a brain, where when you get them all working together, they seem to be capable of doing some pretty complex behaviors that an individual ant or bee wouldn't necessarily be doing on their own. Ants wage war, one colony on another colony. They will send raiding parties into another colony and take larvae from, or pupae from that colony and bring them back and make slaves out of them. Ants typically go through promotional levels where as an adult, the more experienced you are, the more, when you start out, you just work in the nest, and then as you get more experience, you're allowed to go and forage. Unless you're in one of the ants where different adults have different body shapes and do different jobs because of that. But the slaves, what they call them slaves, are never allowed a job that takes them out of the nest, because they will scurry back to their original nest. And when they do escape, it has happened where slaves have managed to escape back to their original nest and bring a raiding party back, basically go, we need to get these guys, and go back and wage war. They're great builders. They build bridges and nests, and they're pretty good problem solvers collectively. It's kind of amazing to look at the intelligence levels of what happens. They ranch. Some species of ants hold onto and protect aphids, and they kind of drink the nectar that goes through the aphids. Some of them live on trees and protect them. Leafcutter ants bring the pieces of leaves back to a big nest where they tend them, and the leaves generate a fungus, and the ants eat the fungus. They don't eat the leaves. So it gets pretty complicated with these guys. Bees have what's called a waggle dance, some of them, where if a bee finds some food, it comes back to the hive, and it will get up on a vertical surface inside the hive and go up and then come down, and all the other bees crowd around because it's dark in there, they can't see. As that they feel, and the angle that it goes down tells the other bees, when you leave the hive, figure out where the sun is. They can see the sun even on a cloudy day because they have polarized ability in their eyes. Turn that angle, and then it's shaking its butt. That's the waggle. And the speed of the waggle tells the other bees, this is how far you gotta go before you start looking for this food that I found. And so the bees come out, and they do interesting things, like if they got the message and now they've gone back and forth a couple of times, now it's a couple hours later, when they come out, they don't orient to the sun where it is before, they orient to the sun now and make the adjustment for, okay, it's later in the day, if I go at the angle I originally went out, I'm gonna miss, I gotta go at a different angle. And somebody did a really neat study where they put the food in a boat and moved the boat farther and farther out into a pond. And they found that the farther into the pond the boat was, the fewer bees would actually leave the hive looking for the food. From which they made the assumption that the bees were not just being programmed with an angle and a distance, they actually knew where they were going before they left. And some of them went, the experienced ones went, that's in the pond, that can't be right. Is that I'm not going looking for food in the middle of the pond because there's not gonna be anything there, so they didn't even leave. So these guys are relatively smart. And then the last group are the non-winged modern, where you can find little nubbins of wings on them, but they never fully develop because they're not, they don't have wings as adults. And the fleas and the lice are in the non-winged group, is that they're both in that group, but they're not really that closely related to one another. And parasitic, is that somebody, remember molecular clocks, where you look at DNA mutations and see where the divergence is? Somebody's been trying to compare head lice and body lice. Well, body lice are specialized to live under clothing. And they figured out, okay, if we can figure out how far apart those two groups diverge, how far back into the past you go, we can figure out when people started to wear clothes regularly. Because you don't have body lice without clothes, and that's when they specialize for moving into the clothes, a different environment, niche isolation. Okay, those are the groups of the insects, and that's it for the chapter.